You've done biographies of living subjects as well as dead subjects. What is the difference in doing that? And the second part question, someone else has actually says, in the case of the Steve Jobs bio, which was authorized and he was involved in, did that interfere with the story you told? There had to have been some things he didn't want in the book.
Yes. First of all, when you're dealing with a living person, that's the first question you have to figure out, which is, are they going to have any control over the book? And in both the case of Steve Jobs, it was amazing because was a kind of control freak. Said, no, I want it to be your book. I'm not even going to vet it before you publish it. It's all yours. Likewise, Jennifer Doudna, who's a very secure person, said, no, it's your book. I want no control. So neither of those books, and and Kissinger I did many, many years ago, were authorized per se, meaning they didn't get to authorize what went in and what went out. Yes, I left some things out, as of Steve Jobs, for example. That was a specific question. And partly it was I'd let my wife, read it too. And there'd be things where Steve might have said something near the end of his life that was kind of mean, because Steve could be a jerk at times to people. Or he'd say something that would be hurtful to either members of his family or close friends or colleagues. And I would weigh how important is that for the reader in order to understand Steve Jobs versus how hurtful will that be and unnecessary. It might have caused a, headline or clickbait in some story, but how necessary is it for me to really put it in? And as I've gotten older, I have been a little bit more willing to say, I'm not just going to put something in because it'll be sensationalistic. If it doesn't really help the reader, and it could be very hurtful, and it could be misleading, because sometimes people say things, especially in Steve Jobs' case when he's being treated for cancer, that doesn't really reflect who they are inside. So that's a long and complicated way of saying, when you write about somebody who's alive, there's a little bit more constraints because they're looking over your shoulder in a way. And I tell you, after I wrote about Henry Kissinger, I was very young. It was back almost in my college days. And I had to deal with him, and then I had to deal with him afterwards. I wasn't particularly excited about the book when he read it. I said, okay, next time I'm going to do somebody who's been dead for 250 years. And that's why I went on to Ben Franklin. Doris, do you have
Well, if
anything
I
to
could
weigh
just
in on
add
that?
something
Yeah.
there, Ted. Yeah, I was just going to comment on that because when I was working on President Johnson's memoirs, he would talk completely openly, and I would take all down those notes. I mean, for example, he was talking about Wilbur Mills, who had always been a thorn in his side because he would keep bills in his committee until he was absolutely sure that they would pass the committee so they would never get hurt and they would pass the floor because he never wanted to have a failure. And so he made a comment, President Johnson did, that he was so worried about saving face for his own reputation that someday he was going to lose his ass. And it turns out later that he's in the reflecting pond with a woman, loses his ass, loses his whole career. And I thought, wow, I'm young too. Like, I think this is great. I put it in the memoir and in the draft. And then as soon as Johnson sees it, he says, I can't say that. I have to be presidential. I can't possibly say that. And he was probably right. But at that time, to me, it sounded like such a great anecdote. So that when you've got a living person and there are people who are still alive, it becomes a very different thing. And I too have never written about, except for my family when I went back and my parents were dead, about a living person ever since then, because it is more complicated. But on the other hand, there's so many questions that I want to ask my dead people that I wish so much they were still alive, and I would ask them the questions that could answer my big questions that I'm writing about in the biography. So it's got a combination of strengths and weaknesses.
And you started with Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream, right? So you had to wrestle with it when you did that.
That was my first book. Yeah, my first article. The first article I ever had published, bizarrely, was in the New Republic, How to Remove Lyndon Johnson. In 1968, it was an anti-LBJ article.
And you were an intern,
article, and then,
right? You were an intern, and I think he moved you to the Labor Department or some exile.
No, actually, well, I was still kept in the White House Fellows Program. It was an article that came out a couple days after the big dance we had to celebrate our White House Fellowship. And then he said he wanted me to work directly for him in the White House, but that was not to be that simple because of the article. Luckily, he didn't kick me out of the program or and undo the entire program, which some people thought he might have. But I did go to the Labor Department, which I loved. And then at the end, when he withdrew from the race, he said, okay, I've withdrawn. Now you got to come work for me. So that's how it all began. It's so bizarre how these relationships began, but thank God it did, because I learned, I think, how to look empathetically at a person, even if I still disagreed with him about the war. And I'd like to believe I brought that empathy and understanding to all the presidents that I studied ever since then. So these experiences, as you had too when you were young, those early books make a difference in how you think about the later ones. We grow as biographers, hopefully.